I went through the Blood of My Blood trailer frame by frame, so you don't have to. Let's talk about it. As always, this will have spoilers for the books and the TV show, so if you were looking to avoid those, please do keep on scrolling. So my initial reaction, this trailer got me excited. It starts out with this almost ominous tempo of a heartbeat running in the background and a few quick clips of Henry during the war and his experiences there before we splice to the first shot of him and Julia together, and it looks like this is them finally meeting one another for the first time. And there's a voiceover from Julia saying, "I don't know how I got here," which echoes Claire from season 1 of Outlander. Then we get the return of that heartbeat tempo again as we see Julia and Henry exchanging their letters that they likely sent to one another for quite some time during the war, which is quickly followed by this shot of the two of them together after Julia gives birth to Claire, and they look like they're sitting on the floor beside a bed. We know from the books that Claire was born in London, so this is probably in London. And Julia's monologue continues by her saying, "Perhaps I've lost my mind," which is such an interesting choice given they look so happy and Julia's monologue is so sad. For some context, the timeline of the war is between 1914 and November of 1918, and Claire was born in October of 1918. So that would mean that the two of them would have met and become pregnant in January of 1918, so they probably courted and were married over the course of the war. Claire's parents supposedly died in a car crash in 1923, which would make Claire 5 years old. That's about all we know about them in the books, so that's some context going into the story that we're supposed to probably remember and rely on. It looks like the two of them went to the Scottish Highlands similar to Claire and Frank did, perhaps for a mini honeymoon of sorts, which we can see here where they are laughing and, having a great time and driving through like Claire and Frank did in their car. Julia's voiceover continues by her saying, "There was a deafening sound," and we see the two of them swerve off the road to avoid hitting a deer and hit this rock and crash. There's also a shot of something falling into water, which I don't believe is the car, but it's very much trying to set up the fact that this is likely the car crash that killed her parents. Julia also continues her monologue by saying, "Then you were gone," and the screen goes blank. Then we see her waking up at the standing stones in almost the exact same shot composition as Claire from season 1 of Outlander. At first glance, I thought that her coat looked darker in that shot than it did when she was driving in the car, meaning that it might have happened on a different day than the car ride. But once again, I think that they're doing a wonderful job of using color grading to sort of give us a visual cue of when someone is time traveling. So Outlander does this sort of desaturated color to show when someone has traveled back in time to the 1700s, which is exactly how these shots are composed here. Then as Julia is looking out over the stones at the landscape, we hear her voice come back and say, "Or perhaps I was," meaning that she's the one that has disappeared. This sort of internal conversation that she's having is almost identical to the one that Claire has when she travels back in time in Outlander, and I think they're definitely playing that up as a hook. I was sort of surprised that they gave so much away in this trailer, but at the same time I'm not, because people who liked the first season, which I thought was magical, will definitely feel nostalgic given everything that's going on in this trailer. We then get the title card for Blood of My Blood, and it's in front of this shot of a hand going over some grasses, which I think is the transition from Claire and her parents to Jamie's parents, Ellen and Brian Fraser, as seen with this shot of Castle Leoch and these people approaching it by a horse and carriage. It looks like there's 2 men and a woman and a very full cart back there. This shot is definitely a hint to the end of season 7 and the whole storyline with Fanny, especially the beginning of the last episode of the season. So if you haven't watched that, you won't understand this so much, but highly recommend you watch that. Then Julia is seen standing inside of a dark room lit by one single candle, talking to this woman here who looks to be one of the housemaids, and she asks her, "What day is it now?" And the woman answers her, "It's a Saturday in the year of 1714. There's also this aerial shot of Castle Leoch, which shows all of these tents set up around the land. I've actually been to Doon Castle where they shoot for Castle Leoch, and it is absolutely beautiful, so I can't wait to see it on screen again. And then we get this shot of Julia walking out to the edge of the castle to look out over the fields, And this again is another parallel to Claire when she first arrived at Leoc in season 1. So now that we know that it's 1714, Claire arrives in 1743, so much later. We get a title card that says 2 love stories before it fades into one of my favorite shots from the trailer, which is Ellen and Brian looking at each other in the horse stables. Then we see them standing out in the open, and Brian introduces himself to Ellen as Brian Fraser, and we can see her eyes change when she hears his last name. She tells Brian that her father detests his, and it's overlaid onto a very quick shot here of both of their fathers, so we get a quick glimpse of what they look like. I think the costumes look incredible. Brian looks so much like Jamie here. He has such a similar outfit on to season 1 Jamie, and I think if you're a fan of season 1 like I am, this whole trailer feels very nostalgic. Then we get the title card connected by time before we see Henry, who has been looking for Julia at the Standing Stones and calling out her name. His hand actually touches that stone at the top there when he first comes into the shot, and we can see here again from the color grading that these 2 shots up above here, the grass looks very green, and then this shot down here, the grass looks extremely desaturated. So I think this is before he goes through the stones, and then this shot here is after he goes through, which would mean yes, both of Claire's parents are time travelers, and that makes sense given that Claire has amplified powers, and we've seen with Jemmy and Mandy that the children of 2 time travelers often end up with amplified powers. None of this is book canon, so it's interesting to see kind of how the showrunners have woven a story together just based on context given to us in the books. So we see Henry in this kind of 1700s color grading as he starts his search for Julia. And at the same time, we get this shot of Julia, who is now dressed in the 1700s garb and looking up at someone as she speaks, and we get to see that it is Ellen. So both parents of Claire and Jamie meet each other. So the moms meet, and I think this is setting up a very, very heavy implication that Julia is responsible for Ellen running away with Brian in the first place. Because we hear Ellen say to Julia, if my brothers heard the slightest whisper of a Fraser, they'd kill him. And Julia says, if you don't go to him, it will haunt you forever. We do get these shots of young Colum and Dougal running through the woods. I'm excited to see them as young men. I think the actors have a real treat in trying to create the younger versions that then incite the older versions. So I think that'll be fun to watch what they do with them. And then we see Ellen and Julia poking their head around a doorway and Julia kind of leaving quietly through the door. I think that Ellen likely helps her try to escape Castle Leoc, similar to Jamie does with Claire in season 1. And I really do think it's an interesting thought to paint Julia as kind of this catalyst for the entire Outlander storyline kicking off, because if Ellen and Brian don't elope, then they don't have Jamie. And if they don't have Jamie, then Jamie and Claire don't happen. And all of what we've watched and read does not happen if Ellen and Brian do not end up together. So very excited for that. We see Ellen riding on horseback, very much like the shots we got of Jamie in season 1, kind of that aerial shot, and we can see her red hair flowing as she goes to meet Brian. And then we get our first shot of young Myrta here, who probably followed her out into the woods and spots them together, which would be interesting because Myrta had admitted that he had a crush on Ellen as a boy, as a kid. So this will be a fascinating subplot. Then we see the 2 of them dancing together at a gathering of some sort. Then we see Ellen at her wedding and Brian looking very unhappy about it. So this is different from the books here. Afterwards, we see Ellen running to Brian and telling him, I'll get out of it, I swear it, and Brian being punched by this man from behind. We see Julia here inside of Castle Leoc before her voiceover comes on, and she tells Ellen, I know how it feels to be parted from true love. And then in my favorite shot of Ellen here with her tartan on, Julia says to her, I sense it in you. We get this lovely parallel of Dougal and World War I. This shot here that kind of introduces us to the redcoats again. This looks like Henry being dragged outside here. We get another shot of Brian, probably at his home, juxtaposed with Julia during the war at an air raid. Then all these very quick succession shots that get me very excited. Then we see this conversation with young Ned Gowan. Henry going through it again, and I missed a few, but